Luis Martinez, and we're here to talk about trade and customs. Our panel is titled Customs and Trade Issues Involved in Nearshoring of Production Capacity. So we decided given the short amount of time, we're not going to project anything. We're going to go directly to questions and answers. I'm going to do a very brief presentation of the panelists. I really feel humbled with the people that are in the group. All of them know very well trade and customs. And I'll do a very brief presentation starting with Emilio here on my right. So Emilio has been practicing trade for many years. He practices with a firm called Vazquez Tercero in Mexico City that belong to his family, one of the oldest trade remedies firms in Mexico. Then we have Chandri Navarro from Hogan and Lovells in Washington, D.C. It's a huge firm, and she's very well recognized as a trade attorney, not only in D.C., but in the United States. And you've met Alejandro Gómez Strozzi. He just had a presentation. He used to be the head of trade practices, trade remedies from the government of Mexico, oopsie. And then we have Marisol over there to a little bit more to the right. She also practices trade remedies with Ricardo Hernandez. He used to be a appellate body member of the World Trade Organization. Really honored to have you here and lucky to be working with him. And on further right is Matt. Matt works with Larry Hanson. He has an law office here in Texas who practices customs and is the former head of the chair of the USMBA. So welcome, everybody. I'll go right into the details. So I have a question that I would like to make here to Chandri. Chandri, what do you think are the driving forces behind nearshoring?
So the earlier panel stole a little bit of my thunder. Obviously, it's U.S.-China policy, in my view, that is driving the nearshoring. I've been practicing customs trade law for 30 years, and I can tell you that the last 4 or 5 have been probably the busiest in my career. Starting with, in 2018, obviously the Trump administration instituting steel and aluminum duties, the steel duties of 25%, aluminum duties of 10% on a number of countries, Mexico included, but then was excluded. And then Section 301 duties up to 25% on practically all imports from China. That started sort of the impetus. And then we had a new forced labor law. So the one thing the earlier panel did not cover is something that is now become one of the biggest parts of my practice, which is compliance and dealing with enforcement of the U.S. forced labor law. So in 2016, a bipartisan group of members of Congress passed a amendment to a law that's been in effect since 1930. The Tariff Act of 1930 bans all imports into the United States containing forced labor, any amount of forced labor. But there was a significant loophole that said if the product wasn't available in sufficient amounts to meet demand in the United States, there was this exception. And so basically it had no teeth. In 2016, that consumptive demand exception was removed, and the U.S. started enforcing it. And who did they start enforcing it under Trump? It was China. And then then we had, of course, the pandemic, which caused all sorts of supply chain issues. And the U.S. government and the Congress started getting nervous about dependence on China. I spent a good part of the pandemic working on getting PPE and hand sanitizer into the United States. So we all lived through that. And then it became advising companies on what to do because they couldn't get their goods out of China, or the transportation was a nightmare, or China had shut down once again because of their strict COVID rules. So between supply chain issues and the duties that the earlier panel and I just mentioned, it became really finally enough for companies to think that they had to look elsewhere for their sourcing. started helping companies move some of the production out of China into Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, next door, but keeping as much as possible in China because, of course, it's cheaper, and there's an integrated supply chain. So how much can you do in China? Move your production of the finishing of your products into Malaysia, Indonesia, and now have a product that's a Malaysian origin and not subject to those high tariffs we talked about. And then we moved into the Uyghur forced labor law, which was passed and became effective in June of last year, which basically says that anything made in the Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, the Xinjiang region of China, is per se forced labor. And then from a list of a number of entities, and XPP is one of them, and under XPP there's hundreds of Chinese companies. So that has caused a lot of consternation because it has become a bipartisan priority to stop imports that contain any Uyghur forced labor within the product. And it could be one screw in a laptop. And to that end, I can tell you there has been, to date, $2 billion worth of trade that has been stopped due to the forced labor law. 5,000 shipments. And most of them not from China. They're coming from Vietnam, from Malaysia, Indonesia, electronics. And so this is affecting all of our clients that are producing products and importing into the United States. So I think that really sets the stage as to why companies are starting to look at something that's a little bit less of an administrative nightmare and a huge problem in terms of tracing your supply chain to make sure that not one small fiber, not one screw is coming from China.
Wow. I have lots of questions, but I got to move on. Alejandro, I want to ask you something. So you have all these opportunities with nearshoring. Is there a Mexican import duty policy to take advantage of these opportunities?
Well, as mentioned in the last panel, we have a significant number of treaties. However, for imports coming out of non-treaty countries or non-FTA countries, Mexico has just increased their tariff out of the blue without prior notice as mandated or as permitted by Mexican law. Basically, I think this was done by pressure of the U.S. government into the Mexican government in order to avoid Chinese steel, again, Chinese steel coming into Mexico through illegal, well, at least not so formal venues into Mexico, being slightly transformed and then into the U.S. We see this as a political move. No big deal. It is published in the Federal Register, but you have to, businesses have to learn to live with it. And in order to be wise as to rules of origin, so it's a full round of concepts that should go into navigating the trade policy of Mexico and along with the USMCA partners.
Interesting. So keeping with the tariffs, this one's for you, Emilio. Are tariff preferences in free trade agreements that Mexico has or trade programs that Mexico has enough for this nearshoring opportunity?
Thank you, Luis, and I'm very honored to be here again in the USMBA. Thank you for the invitation. And I mean, I think the previous panel discussed like what are the key features for attracting new investment in Mexico, and of course it's infrastructure, energy. So I won't delve in that again, but our Maquiladora program or the IMEX program has been working, but there has been something very interesting that happened recently. The USTR with Caterina Tai did request an investigation, a report from the USITC, which is the International Trade Commission, to research on how the free trade zones in the United States are working in comparison to the IMEX program and the Canadian free trade zones. And what they have found is the obvious, that the IMEX is working well in manufacturing sectors. And they show this in their report. Now, why did the USTR ask for this report? In the context of nearshoring or reshoring, it's clear from my point of view that the USTR or the government of the United States wants to develop or improve their free trade zones in the short term. This may be done maybe next year, or there will be, or it will be in a couple of years where we will start seeing what will change in the free trade zones, because there are many limitations regarding certificates of origin, regarding deferral of import duties in free trade zones. So that's why there are so many companies that come into Mexico, despite the recent increase on tariffs, which doesn't help. So I don't think that in the short term, our programs are going to be enough if the U.S. does change its free trade zone policies. And then add the issue about the free trade agreements. Mexico apparently already agreed with the European Union, but the treaty hasn't been signed in 6 years. There's no free trade policy in Mexico. The free trade is only with the United States. So it's not enough what's happening right now, or it will not be enough in the near future. And I would stick with that answer with Tesla and invoking Tesla and saying, why did Tesla came to Mexico or Monterrey? Because of the IMEX program, because of lower duties, and Mexico is changing a bit the rules, and we may fall behind if we don't change.
Oh, yeah. Great. So moving on to Marisol. So you practice a lot of anti-dumping in countervailing cases. Can you tell us what's the current situation regarding trade remedies in Mexico? And I'll make a second question right there. Is it possible to see an increase in that trend of anti-dumping cases against Mexican exports in the U.S. market?
Well, as you all know, anti-dumping and countervailing measures are intended to protect an industry from unfair trade practices such as dumping and subsidies. This is an important issue that needs to be considered when selecting a nearshoring partner. The current situation shows that the U.S. measures have been imposed or focused only on the Asian markets, particularly in China. And in the last decade, as you know, China had an exponential growth, and this led to several measures that has been applied by the U.S. These measures have a direct impact in the access to the U.S. market. Why? Because mainly the effect of these type of measures is that de facto they restrict the market. The volume of imports are reduced. We are lawyers, but we know that statistics don't lie. And since 2016, the United States has imposed less than 10 duties against Mexican products. In contrast, the United States has imposed new 100 measures against China. So, I mean, this is important. As nearshoring gains traction, what the question I think that will become is that if we will really see that the United States will replicate the measures applied to China to the Mexican market. So what are we going to see? What are we looking for? Let me give you a couple of examples. Regarding anti-dumping measures, there is a recent investigation on mattresses from Mexico. The United States already had anti-dumping duties on imports of this product from China, but now they are doing this investigation in order to, even if valid, restrict the imports from Mexico and other 12 countries. So maybe these type of investigations will increase. Emilio pointed out the manufacturing programs such as IMEX or FROSEC. This is relevant in the countervailing duties imposed by subsidies. The U.S. determined in a recent investigation that the roulette permit that is used in these programs for maquila or this type of operations is considered a countervailing duty. So what will happen if these new relocated companies start to taking advantage of these programs? Probably in a few years, 2-3 years, we will start to see that countervailing duties are restricting the market, and that in fact these companies that have been relocated doesn't really have a strategy to continue with this kind of operation and taking advantages of these programs.
So what I'm trying to say is that we will need to remember that the U.S. is a big player, a key player in the anti-dumping system. This, coupled with an effective anti-dumping system, leads to a trend in which Mexico will probably be a target of the products that are already being manufacturing with these new companies. The question that you posed, it's also very similar in the side of Mexico. Mexico has practically initiated only one anti-dumping investigation against US products per year. But in contrast, Mexico has imposed near 50 anti-dumping measures against China. So it's very similar to the situation that it's applied to US authorities. The thing here is that these measures are imposed practically on semi-finished products, such as steel plate, wire rod, polyester, steel pipes. So I think that the key matter lies, or the problem lies, in the input. And when we are talking about the input, as Matt was saying, we need to look at the rules of origin in the USMCA. The USMCA content requirements, for example, demands that 70% of the steel and aluminum used by automakers is originated in North America. So together, these kind of measures, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, rules of origin, will really disrupt the supply chain. Finally, what I'm trying to say is that what we should look for is that these type of measures have a long-term effect. It's not something that we are going to look right now, but maybe, for example, next year, we are going to see if petitions are actually filed against Mexican products in the US. And if that happens, we will see preliminary duties against Mexican imports around 2025. So I think that even if valid, these type of restrictions need to be looked out by the new companies that are searching for a new place to start operations and that are not considering this long-term effect with these kind of measures.
Very clear. Very clear. No, don't go. I'll move. I'll stay with you. I have another question for you. So many U.S. companies have announced significant investments in Mexico or have already relocated their production to Mexico. Do you think the Mexican authorities will adapt a different stance on trade remedies regarding these companies, these products?
Well, I think that for that, we need to also look at the political aspect. We, in Mexico, we will have elections next year, so the political view of the authority can change completely. Currently, the anti-dumping authority in Mexico doesn't have a chief, and in the last 6 years, they have changed it like 4 or 5 times. So that really make us think of that, how we don't really know how the authority will react regarding this type of exports. What it's a fact is that if Mexico replicates the same standard that it's applying to China to the US exports, this will create a problem for the relocated companies.
Yes.
So I insist we will need to look at this issue, because we are thinking right now in several aspects, but we are not considering that this could be potentially a deterrent of nearshoring.
Very interesting. Here's another question that I think it's for Emilio. Is the USMCA rapid response mechanism a deterrent for nearshoring?
Thank
Here's
you.
the second one in that same. So, in the interest of time, Mexican trade bans regarding forced labor at customs.
Thank you, Luis. And just to follow up, perhaps briefly on what Marisol said, and regarding the mattress potential investigation about Mexican products or Mexican mattresses. What's funny is I remember a Chinese client asking me about rules of origin of mattresses to establish in Mexico. The opinion was given. They established, and now they face a potential investigation. So it's real. I mean, I think it's important to, as Marisol said, see what the U.S. has done, and if the company or the Chinese or from another part of the world is coming to Mexico, see if that product has been subject to measures in the United States. Now, as for labor, this is it is clear that it's very novel. We kind of mention it frequently in these types of events. But what I find really interesting is that the rapid response mechanism has been used specifically or mainly against the auto sector or the auto parts sector. There has been about 12 cases, and most of them have to do with automotive industry and even glass, tires, and certain auto components from the vehicles. And it is, or it could be, a deterrent because one plant or one factory did close or is closing. It's called VU Manufacturas, because they have been subject to 2 reviews. And perhaps it's too costly to have to engage in the negotiations, the collective bargain, and they prefer to shut down the company. So it is real. And right now there is a petition. There still has, until my knowledge, maybe it popped up today in the news, but there is a company from Chinese company owned Asia Way, which also auto part. So it's not only U.S. investment coming into Mexico that have been subject to a petition for review of the rapid response mechanism, but it's going to be from all countries, foreign investment from all countries. And that's going to be interesting to see how Chinese facilities are going to react to these sort of measures and whether they were aware about this. So, and as for forced labor, well, I think Mexico, perhaps, I'm not sure how it's going to develop. Maybe we're going to have more work in the future, like you in the U.S., so maybe that's a positive thing. But we only have a decree that outlines the process where the Ministry of Labor is going to conduct an investigation from a petition from any interested person. And what I found interesting is that the Ministry of Labor is going to coordinate with an agency in the country of origin or with another agency from another country. So say, be it the USA. I think after 2 years or 3, pending this type of agreements, because this was in the USMCA, we finally have the rules, but we don't know how they're going to be applied, honestly.
Okay, Matt, there's a lot of things, a lot of things that Mexican exporters need to be aware of when exporting into the U.S. What do they have to do to elevate the compliance with U.S. law in order to not have any friction at the time of importation?
So, the answer that won't surprise any anybody in the room is to have to work with an expert, work with somebody who's in this area, develop compliance, and identify risk. In terms of the exact issue, whether it's labor, if you're in automotive, you're trying to comply with the USMCA, and it's extreme rigors there on what you're required to do. You need to have somebody who can understand and identify your risks for you on that issue. If it is forced labor, you need someone to identify the risks and determine what can we do to hedge those risks. So what can you do? The biggest thing, and one of the biggest issues for clients that we run into, is having documentation from your suppliers, having support for the programs that you're going to be participating in. I think it was said in the first panel as well, but if you are going for your preferential treatment under the USMCA, you need to make sure that you can prove everything at the time of import into the United States to a U.S. Customs official. They have the right to request and demand those documents, and they need to be provided at that time. So that's just with regard to the USMCA, for example. If we're talking about the UFLPA and you have, you're still obtaining raw materials or any materials from China, and I think that we can all forecast that it's going to continue to be a problem no matter where Chinese production is located in the world, whether it goes to South Asia first or whether it moves to Mexico. It's a definite risk. And so you'll need documentation. You'll need to support that none of the raw materials are coming from Uyghur region or from listed parties and prohibited parties. And I'll say too, being involved at the contract stage is extremely beneficial. There's not often, someone with the trade background who's part of those negotiations who can say, all right, write this portion in, make sure that you include as a condition of receipt of goods, you also receive production records. You also receive, cost figures on your commodities and your inputs. And then finally, I'll close with the sometimes dubious prospect of going to the U.S. government themselves and requesting a binding ruling for your company. So if you're going to take this route, you'd want to do it the proper way, which is to be fully prepared with what you believe is the correct answer. And if your manufacturing operation has some flexibility, maybe various different factual scenarios, you can present all those scenarios in your binding ruling request. But you do need to be careful what you wish for. It will be binding. So, if you don't have the funds to continue to fight that at a legal level, or you're not willing to change your operations if you don't like what you hear, then you need to also consult an attorney on those matters before pursuing a ruling.
Good. Thank you, Matt. Chandri, back to you. So what can Mexican companies do to take advantage of all this, all this that is happening with nearshoring?
Consult a good lawyer.
Oh, there you go. You have a lot of them over here.
I definitely think you need to really keep a close eye on what's happening in your biggest market. If your biggest market is the United States, what's happening there in terms of anti-dumping, countervailing duties, Section 301. These kinds of cases are sort of magnified. But I think what's most making me nervous is where we're seeing a lot of Chinese investment coming into Mexico, because you're running that risk of the U.S. government seeing it and now starting to target Mexico because it's Chinese investment. So it's no longer sort of the nice neighbor next door. It's still part of that China policy. And particularly with this forced labor aspect, The minute you've got any Chinese content, you become suspect on forced labor. So what can Mexican companies do? Integrate your supply chain within the Western Hemisphere. The minute you do that, the better you're going to look to the U.S. government, to U.S. importers, right? Because that's why companies left Mexico to begin with to go to China. I mean, I spent the early part of my career helping companies like Hanes and Levi's come to Mexico, invest in Mexico, set up opportunities here. But trying to get the yarn and the fabric and the trim into Mexico, there wasn't enough of it, and the labor rates became cheaper, and this entire sort of supply chain in China that wasn't existent here. Now that has expanded, really try to look at what is that supply chain, because if you're dependent on Chinese content, you're going to run serious risk of A, forced labor, or B, any of these other cases. For example, even though Mexico was excluded from the aluminum 232 duties, I'm hearing that there's, an attempt now to maybe bring in a 232 duty on Mexican aluminum. So even though you're sort of the friendly neighbor from next door, you're not immune to some of these cases, to some of these tariffs, and especially if there's Chinese content. So integrate your supply chain. Sell yourselves as being no forced labor and an option against forced labor. Integrate with the Western Hemisphere and watch what's going on in the U.S. in terms of our imports really going up in certain areas. That's going to be more risky. Look at other areas.
You mentioned a place in China that I can't pronounce, that it's per se considered forced labor. Why per se? Can you expand a little bit on that?
So the Uyghur, it's Uyghur with a U, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed and became effective in June of 2022. What the law says is that any production within the Xinjiang region of China, which is a significant region of China, is considered per se forced labor, because the allegations are that the government of China is putting Uyghurs, a Muslim minority population in the Uyghur region, to work in labor camps. They are, allegedly doing all sorts of sort of forced labor, and now even moving Uyghurs out of the Uyghur region, the Xinjiang province, into other parts of China and even outside of China. So that's why any Uyghur working anywhere, or a company that has any connection with the Uyghur Autonomous Region, is considered being involved in forced labor, and therefore any amount of contact, any touch point in your supply chain with that region or companies in that region, or with Uyghurs in other parts of China or the world, are banned from entering the United States.
Just a follow-up question. Does the U.S. how does the U.S. have visibility when those products come out of that region?
So there are NGOs primarily. The U.S. Customs has their own investigators and folks out in China and looking at these things. But really what we've seen is there are a few NGOs that are really working in the space. There's the university in the UK that is, completely focused on this. There's Professor Laura Murphy who's completely focused on this. Every time they issue a report, we see action in the United States. So it's these NGOs out there taking a look at what's going on, and we don't know how much investigation U.S. Customs is actually doing, or they're just sort of taking their case. There has recently been a case now suing the U.S. government on this. So, and we think that there's sort of an Administrative Procedures Act issue here, because these companies are getting named, you're getting detentions, and there's really no understanding of what the allegation is or what the problem was. I mean, I've had clients that had shipments stopped for medical devices and try to get those from being released by U.S. Customs. You've got to prove that nothing in that entire chain of your supply chain has touched China. Try getting production records, payment records, shipping records, 7 tiers down in your supply chain from China. not super easy. Meanwhile, you're getting demurrage costs. You're not being able to provide. In this case, it was surgical sponges, right, that are needed in surgery. We couldn't get them out. So it's a real issue right now.
So if I were to summarize a takeaway point for you, for the audience that are attorneys, if you have clients in Mexico that are manufacturing and exporting to the US, it's very important to have a US trade attorney review your operation just in case you're doing it correctly and don't violate any import US law issues. Very interesting. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. If the audience wants to ask a question, they can raise their hand. But I'll make one to Emilio regarding EMEX and the U.S. investigation as to how the free trade zones are operating in the U.S. Do you have any information regarding what results that investigation has brought and if they're going to change the policy in the U.S. and what would Mexico need to do in return to make those export programs at least competitive and efficiently?
Thank you, Luis. And I remember that when we discussed that the topic of this conference was going to be nearshoring and that the origin of the idea came from the New York Times article. I don't know if everyone read it, but it's so interesting because, again, mattresses. I'm not sleepy, but mattresses. They are even quoted in that article. There's a Hofusan plant, a Chinese industrial plant in Monterey, and there has been Chinese investment going there, and it had to do with EMEX. So the idea here, or I believe that the USCR wanted to see what is happening in their free trade zones, why or in which sectors free trade zones in the US are lacking or lagging behind Mexican. For instance, there were 5 sectors that were analyzed. One was manufacturing or automotive, one was furniture, another one was energy, another one was garment, and I'm missing another one. So in these sectors they analyzed, and of course Mexico has a good performance, and there's an explanation of how there are less users in free trade zones in the US because the EMEX, if you're a pure maquila, you have tax benefits, you can issue certificates of origin from an EMEX, and so on. So those were the aspects that the USTR wanted to see and analyze and have them there. And the US ITC, which prepared the report, does not issue policy recommendations. But they issue findings, and they shared what the findings are occurring in free trade zones in the US. So what I think is that the free trade zones may adopt a similar policy as like the EMEX policy and the free trade zones in Canada. So maybe there would be duty deferral in the free trade zones, and we have special rules that apply for exports between the U.S. and Mexico in this regard. And but in the end, what happens is that our tax credits to new investments, there's nothing, as the new panel discussed. And Tesla, going back to Tesla is back here because there are tax credits for the electric auto industry in this Inflation Act. So Mexico is benefiting of not doing anything, and while everyone else is giving credits, and we are having the benefits of nearshoring, but we don't know if in the future the free trade zones in the US is going to change, and it's going to be more competitive being in the US rather than being in Mexico if we have some labor issues with the rapid response mechanism and so on.
Interesting. Any question from the audience? If not, I'll continue with my questions. Oh, Matt, there you go. That's a question from a trade attorney. That's Nick Baker. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. Well, I think, and Emilio could correct me if I'm wrong, but the Mexican authorities, I mean, they are not doing enough, but the Mexican companies are really considering this as an advantage. But there are specific sectors, for example, sensitive sectors like steel, which does not consider it as such, because for them, this could represent several changes and several modifications that they have to make, and this have an negative impact in their operations. So there are specific industries. We will need to look at every company to see how they are affected by the ERA or these kind of measures.
Great. You want to compliment something?
Yeah, I would say that inflation sometimes is addressed in applications of anti-dumping duties, and we saw this in ammonium sulfate, for instance, with the suspension of the ADs. But when we talk with sensitive sectors like steel, that doesn't happen, no? And as Alejandro mentioned, that there has been an increase of tariffs. Mexico has this ability of increasing tariffs according its WTO schedules, which can be up to 35% in most cases. So we can increase tariffs as we wish, and Mexico has done that, and that will have effects in inflation, and it also is targeting those products that are already being investigated in AD investigations or applications, like tires. So that's going to be tires, steel, garment, fabric, and so on. So it's a huge list, 361, I believe, tariff items that increase tariffs.
We got 1 or 2 more minutes. Alejandro and Matt, do you want to add something to wrap it up?
Yes, I would like to add that we haven't spoken about politics. The wolf is coming. Political timing is nearing in both countries, both in the U.S. and Mexico, and it will likely we'll see a spark or increase in aggressiveness on politicians and candidates. So we should help our clients keep a cool head and stick to the rule of law. So that should be a challenge, but as well an opportunity for us to help USMCA keep flowing as it's supposed to.
Good, yeah. Matt?
Yeah, I'll echo those sentiments, and that even tying into the AD/CVD context, in the United States, the domestic industry and sort of the politics around initiating an investigation or pursuing an order on goods is initially highly deferential to the U.S. companies. So speaking to Marisol's point earlier as well, I would expect in 2025 or in the very, very near term to see domestic industry in the U.S. pressing for investigations from the Department of Commerce on Mexican industry. And it's something that we need to keep our clients apprised of and monitor really how those things are developing and get involved earlier. If you're not involved in the process, you will get stuck. And so you need to be involved.
Chandri, I saw you face light up.
Yeah, I would go back to the question on sensitive industries. No question that I think both the U.S. Congress and administration are looking at those sensitive industries and what are they, and even expanding that list, whether it's chips or solar or it's some drugs, where I think during the pandemic they realized how dependent the U.S. was on imports in those industries. So I definitely think that we have clients that are looking at those lists of products and looking at where can they move investment, and Mexico should be looking at them. I know other countries in the Western Hemisphere are and should be really looking at those lists, because I think it's going to expand even more.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much. I would like to ask the audience to help me thank the panelists for this great presentation. Really, really humbled. Thank you very much.